In today's video, we're going to explain why you don't need $1 million to retire. The question that comes up the most in my consultations with clients is, do I need to save over $1 million to retire? And for many of them, the answer is surprisingly better than they think. The problem is that a lot of retirees get led down the path by online financial gurus who tell them that either they need more or less than they actually need. So in today's video, we're going to answer the question of how much do I need and how do I calculate my magic retirement number? And by the way, if you have any questions that you want me to answer in future videos, comment and subscribe, and what I'll do is I'll answer those questions in a later video coming up in the next few weeks. But for now, let's dive right into the magic number. So the $1 million number, I think, stems from a survey that Northwestern Mutual made back in 2020, where they asked a lot of retirees, how much do you think you need to be able to retire comfortably? And that number was, almost $1 million. Now, as you can see from this Wall Street Journal article, that number has since risen up to almost 1.5 million in the latest 2024 survey that Northwestern Mutual has done. Now, before you freak out, I want to break this down because the reality is you may not need that much to actually retire. So how much you need to retire is really going to depend on your lifestyle. And I know that's not satisfying to hear, but the reality is it really does depend. So let me give you a couple of examples that you guys can think about. At my previous firm, we had a couple of clients that really represent the extremes of this. So one client, these guys, it was a couple, and they really only had about, $400,000 or $500,000 of investable assets, not a crazy amount, but they owned their own home and they lived in the kind of inexpensive area of town. So it wasn't Scottsdale, it was kind of the West Valley, if you're familiar with that. And so their cost of living was lower. I've never seen anybody like this. They actually were able to live off of only Social Security. In fact, they'd actually give us money back at the end of the year, maybe $1,000, maybe $2,000 to invest. So that's incredible. So these guys, even though they really didn't have much money at all, they were totally fine in retirement and they just didn't really have that many expensive hobbies. Now, the contrast to that is we had a newer client. This person had tens of millions of dollars in the bank. And within the first 2 months of her being our client, she literally spent $400,000 on clothing. We had to have a heart-to-heart with her almost immediately because even though, she had a lot of money, like I'm talking, close to $15 million, if you're spending that kind of money on clothing alone, there's no way that it's going to last. So she needs way more than $1.5 million. So I think you guys can start to see the biggest driver is going to be your lifestyle. But that said, it's important to be able to kind of figure out what is my magic number, because this way you're going to be able to have a goal in mind, and then you're going to be able to plan around all the important details of how do I get there. So what I'm going to do in today's video, I'm going to break this down as simple as I possibly can so everybody who's watching can kind of calculate what's my magic number and, how do I get there? All right, so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and I've built this little Excel worksheet so we can actually calculate it, and I'll take you, like I said, step by step through the calculation. So number one, the first thing you're going to want to do is figure out what's my expected life expectancy, and then also calculate the number of years you expect to be retired. What I suggest you to do, just as a baseline for this, is go to the Social Security Administration website, and they actually have a life expectancy calculator that you can use. All you got to do is just type in your sex and then type in your date of birth. So let me pull this up on my screen so you guys can see what it looks like that comes out from Social Security. This person born in November of 1964, so they're 60 years old. And what Social Security is telling you is that you could expect, if you're 60 now, to live to 83.3. This is for a male, right? It would be a little bit longer if you're a female. So what is important is that they haven't factored in things like your health, lifestyle, expected longevity based on your family's history. And so we're going to figure out how to adjust for that. So if you look at my sheet here, I've got my current age 60. I'm going to put my life expectancy in there at 84. And what we're going to do, we're either going to add or subtract years from this based on our own situation. I'm going to add 5 years to it because let's just be safe. I have no, reason to do that or not, but let's just make it a little bit longer. I think it's generally better to be conservative when you do these things. Now, you'll notice next what I've done, I want to figure out my desired retirement age. This, in our case, is kind of arbitrary, but what I've done is just put 67 here because that's the full retirement age for Social Security, but you don't have to use that age if you don't want to. So then what we do is we go, okay, my adjusted life expectancy is 89, and I'm going to subtract my desired retirement age from that to get my number of retirement years to 22. And that's going to come into play a little bit later, and I'll explain why that's important. Now, the second thing we want to do is run a budget, because we're really going to have to dial in our expenses. This is probably the most important part of our exercise, and this is something that you do want to spend some time on. You can see I've got a few line items here. You could go crazy if you want, but what we really need to do is get an average annual expense estimate over time. I know that it's going to vary, but what we're going to do is average out these one-time expenses, and we're just going to lump them in with our annual expense here. So let me kind of break down what this means. So I've got regular expenses. In regular expenses, this is going to be your regular living stuff. So whatever you generally spend on housing, that's utilities. If you have rent is there. If you have a mortgage, that's there too. And, we'll factor in if that's going to end early. That would kind of be something you'd want to average out instead of expecting it to go for the full 22 years. So you do need to adjust for that. But generally, a lot of people, their mortgages are paid off. And so really you're talking about they've got property taxes, annual maintenance on their home, groceries, all of that goes into here. I would even put my regular Medicare expenses in this. And then something else you're going to have to think about is what kind of income taxes you're going to pay, right? And there are online calculators that you can go and kind of estimate that. So, be aware that things are going to change, right? You're not going to have the same expenses that you had while you were working. So gas should go down, clothing should go down. Your taxes should be a little bit lower because you're not going to have to pay for Medicare or Social Security taxes anymore, but you're going to have these extra expenses. I've got LTC here. That's long-term care. I've got extra travel. I've got new cars. It could be anything. It might be home improvements, might be a category that you need to put out there for extra expenses, and I'll show you how to average that out over time. But for your regular expenses, what I suggest, go get one of those apps online that will help. It will tie to your bank account, and it will even tie to your credit cards, and you can get a really good idea of what you've been spending, and then you can kind of adjust from there. Now we'll go on to these sort of irregular expenses. You notice I've got LTC, and as I mentioned, that means long-term care. So in the United States, on average, the national average is $68,000 a year for long-term care expenses. And what they say is that anybody over 65, or not anybody, but 70% of people over the age of 65 can expect to spend some time in long-term care. What I've done here is I said, okay, let's assume that at some point in your retirement, you are going to have 2 years of long-term care expenses. So that's $136,000 total. Now, obviously, you're not going to have that every year in your retirement, and that's where this average comes into play. So what we're going to do is we're going to say 2 years times 68,000, and then we're going to divide that by the number of years that we are retired. That's how you get the $6,182 number. Same thing for extra travel. I say, okay, great. I'm 67. I want to spend some time traveling outside of my regular budgeted travel. Regular budgeted travel is going to go into this regular category. That might be like, $200 a month for, weekend trips, whatever. This is extra stuff that's not going to go on forever. So what I've done here, I took $15,000, take it times 7, and then we divide that by 22. You get the average, $4,700. I did the same thing for new cars, right? I just said, okay, After trade-in value, I might spend 50 grand. We divide that by 22, and that's how we get this average. Okay, but spend some time on this. It doesn't have to be perfect, and I would err on the side of caution, meaning I would probably pad this. So, you can see this is $5,000 a month on your regular expenses. Maybe if that's what you came through after doing a pretty good budget, add an extra $500 on there just to be safe. Something always comes up, right? So, be conservative. Now, you can probably guess the next step is going to be figuring out our income. We want to calculate our income from all of our sources. In this person's case, they only have one type of income to expect, and that's Social Security. This is the max Social Security number right now. It would be almost $46,000 in a year. This person has no pension, but if you do, you put that average annual total. If you had rental income, great, annuities. And I put something down here for other. And what I mean by this is some people might consider working part-time in retirement. Maybe you can do consulting. So, maybe you say, oh, I might consult for 3 years for 50 grand a year, let's say. And if you think that's realistic, put 150,000 divided by 22, and that's going to go over here and add to your annual average. So spend some time thinking about this. This side of the equation is probably going to be a little bit easier than expenses, but nevertheless, we need both of these before we can continue. All right, so now that we've got both of these, the next step is pretty simple. We're going to calculate the net annual income that we need to live. And this is very simple. We're just going to take expenses minus our income, and we need that to figure out our magic retirement number. So I'm going to drop this down, and you can see expenses minus income, and that's net annual needed. Now you might say, well, what if my income is above my expenses? Well, then I'm going to tell you, you're in a great position, and that might mean you actually need to start spending more in retirement. Live an enhanced lifestyle, or think about, charity, something like that. But if that's the case, good for you, you're in a good spot. Now, we've got this net annual income needed. Next comes the part where we need to use a little bit more math, and we're going to kind of figure out the return estimates. So step number 5 is going to be calculate our inflation-adjusted expected return. I know that's a lot of words there, and it sounds a little difficult, but it's not as bad as what you think. Basically, all we're doing is we're going, okay, what's a reasonable return estimate that we can use for our investment portfolio? And then what we're going to do is adjust that for inflation. Notice what we talked about earlier for expenses and income. We did not adjust that for inflation. Well, here's where the inflation adjustment comes in for our calculation. Let me drop down our next menu and let's kind of talk this through. So I want you guys to keep this real simple. There's a million ways we could make this overly complex, but the reality is when you're actually doing this in the real world, all of this stuff is going to kind of change. And so that level of precision isn't going to really matter. I'm going to show you how to adjust stuff, and I'll show you kind of what makes a difference, but don't waste your time being like, oh man, what about real estate? What kind of returns do I have for that? And private equity and gold and all of these things. We just really need to get a very baseline estimate, and what we want to do is make sure that we're not overestimating returns. That's really what matters, and that's what we're going to talk about. So what I've got here is just a 2 asset class portfolio. I'm going to say I've got stocks and bonds, and what I've done, I've got my return estimate for stocks. I've thrown that in at 11%, and I've got my bonds in at 4.7%. Where do I get this information? Well, I simply went to New York University's website. They've got it for free, and I downloaded their workbook on historical asset class returns. Let me show you. I'm in this workbook right now. So what they've done is they've got the S&P 500, including dividends, T-bills, which is cash. They've got 10-year bonds. That's what I use to calculate the bond expected return. They've got other corporate bonds, real estate, gold. Like I said, we don't need all that, but if you do want to get a little bit more granular, you can do it. So what I did when I downloaded it, I calculated what was the compounded annual return over time since 1928, just to give us a baseline estimate. So I go back to our sheet. That's where I got the 11%. Same thing for bonds. The long-term 10-year bond return was 4.7. You guys can just feel free to use these numbers. I point this out just because what I don't want you to do is go, well, stocks have returned 15% in the last 15 years and use that, because that's higher than our long-term average, and I want you guys to be more conservative. If we want to be more conservative, we can do that. I mean, I could literally just take these and ratchet down by 20% for each of them. It's fine. The next part of our calculation is we're going to go, okay, I've got this mix of assets in my portfolio. How do I calculate what that total portfolio would return? So I want to just start with a very simple baseline of a reasonable asset allocation for a retiree might be 50% stocks, 50% bonds. We could argue about what that is, but we're right in the middle of the road here. Again, I don't want you guys to spend a ton of time thinking about that. Just don't go out there and put a 100% stock portfolio unless you're really convinced that's right for you. All right. So, everybody has a different risk tolerance and time horizon and all those things. And yes, you need to factor them in, but we don't have time in this video to go over all of that. And a 50-50 portfolio is pretty reasonable for most people. Now, how do I calculate my expected return? There's a few ways. We want to keep this as simple as possible. So the easiest way is just to take a weighted average calculation. And that's simply 11% times 50% plus 4.7% times 50%, right? It's expected return times weight plus expected return times weight. That's going to get us our expected return on the portfolio. And now we're going to have to adjust for inflation. So let me drop this down, and I've got inflation here at 3.3%. Where do I get that number? Well, same workbook. They have inflation rates here. And what I did, they've got it since 1914. I just went in and I took the average of inflation since 1914, which is 3.3%. And I added that in here to our worksheet right here, 3.3%. And what I'm going to have you guys do is take your estimated return that you calculated above and just subtract the inflation from it. Now, for those of you who are, really technical, the calculation for the inflation adjusted return is actually a little bit more complicated than that. I actually use the real calculation, but guys, you don't need to be that anal, and it's not going to make a big difference. You can see here, 7.8 minus 3.3 is actually 4.5, not 4.4. But guys, trust me, it's not going to make a difference. Keep it simple. You can just subtract it. It's good enough for our purposes. So we've done that. Now we go into our final step, and that's going to be actually calculating our magic return number. And how you do this, you simply take the net annual needed, which is roughly $27,000, and you divide it by our inflation adjusted return. Why do we do this? Well, this calculation actually has a big theoretical basis. This is the dividend discount model formula. So in order to value what a stock is worth, you can use this formula. This is also a common formula used in valuing commercial real estate. So if you've ever bought an office building or some kind of multifamily apartment, really common way to get the valuation is you take the income. It's called net operating income in real estate, and you divide that by the cap rate, which is simply the expected investment return. That's how you get the value. And that's exactly how we're going to get the value for our magic retirement number. So let me drop this down for you guys. We've got our income needed. We divide it by our inflation adjusted return, and that's our magic number. So look what we've got. We've got $621,000. It's a far cry from $1 million. And it's even a far cry from 1.5 million. All right. So, and this isn't crazy, right? I'm not sandbagging the numbers to just inflate your hopes. This is realistic if you live in a fairly low cost area and your house is paid off. Plenty of people are probably in a better situation than they think. Now, if you have a more expensive lifestyle or you have other things you really want to do in retirement, that number is going to be insufficient. So let's kind of look at, what is going to happen if I change my expenses? And then you're going to see, the number is going to blow up. So what I'm going to do, you might be in a higher cost area and you're going to say, man, $5,000 a month regularly isn't even going to come close to cut it for me, especially with taxes and this and that. And so we're going to say, no, how about $8,000 a month, which is $96,000 a year. Put that in. Now all of a sudden you need a lot more money. Okay, now you're closer to that $1.5 million figure that we showed earlier. And so again, this is really to hammer home the point of how much your lifestyle matters to this number, and that there's no just one number that you can use. It's all going to be dependent on your circumstances and what you want to get out of your retirement. But this is useful information because now you can go, well, what can I do to bring my expenses down? Maybe the answer is you have to move to a lower cost place. Maybe you have to sell and downsize. Or maybe you do something over here like, oh man, I have to get a job consulting during retirement. So I'll give you guys another example here. Let's say this person said, oh man, cool. Well, now that I know that, maybe I'm going to have to work extra, just part-time for a few years doing consulting. So maybe realistically, I do that for 4 years, making 50 grand a year. So it's $200,000. Tap that in. It's going to be divided by 22. So that's an extra $9,000 on average. Well, look, now it dropped it down a couple $100,000, right? So you guys see there's, you can impact this retirement number based on your decisions. All right, well, I hope this helps. And if you guys have any questions, hit me up in the comments. And, remember, this is a starting point. Once you've kind of honed in on your magic number, that's when the rubber really meets the road. And that's where a financial planner can create a plan that's going to consider things like optimal asset placement and tax optimization and your withdrawal strategy and your investment strategy, because all of those things are going to incrementally improve your odds of retirement success. And it just doesn't stop at having a magic number, right? You need to actually have a blueprint of how you're going to get there. So if you would like help figuring out what that would look like, click the link in the description below where you can book a complimentary call with me and I can help you figure out what that path looks like for you. Thanks for watching.